Okay, let's unpack this because what we are diving into today is a really fascinating textual analysis.
Yeah, it really is.
We're looking at a highly distilled set of notes focused on the central themes of Surah Fatir, which is the 35th chapter of the Qur'an.
Right.
Now, if you are listening to this right now, you are the kind of person who is always looking to synthesize complex ideas, right? Whether you're analyzing ancient philosophy or, I don't know, trying to understand the historical frameworks that shape modern thought.
Absolutely.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take what is essentially a very brief set of thematic bullet points and subject them to a rigorous analysis. We want to understand how these 7th century themes attempt to address enduring human anxieties.
The big stuff.
Exactly. Our relentless drive for success and the overarching framework of how humanity perceives its place in the universe.
And the structure of the course material we are working with today makes that analytical mission quite intuitive.
How so?
Well, the notes highlight that the chapter is elegantly and clearly deliberately divided into two distinct yet fundamentally connected parts.
Okay.
First, the text presents a set of specific messages directed internally. These are framed as instructions specifically to Muslims, dealing directly with the inner workings of faith, behavioral psychology, and personal conduct.
Right. The internal work.
Exactly. And then the notes indicate a seamless transition where the text broadens its lens entirely. It pivots to messages framed for all of mankind, focusing on universal, existential realities and ontological questions.
I found myself immediately struck by how incredibly concise the source material is. I mean, we are looking at just a handful of lines summarizing an entire chapter of scripture.
It's very dense.
So dense, yet these notes are packed with philosophical assertions about how to view success, how to pursue knowledge, and how to understand our physical and spiritual dependence.
Yeah.
It's just a brilliant reminder to you, the learner, that you don't need a 1,000-page modern treatise to completely reevaluate your worldview.
That is very true.
So let's jump straight into part 1, the inner work. These are the directives framed for believers, and the very first point on our list is a command to trust Allah's control over provision.
To really understand that starting point, we need to look at the Arabic concept of provision, which is risk.
Risk. Okay.
When modern audiences hear the word provision, they typically think of
A paycheck.
a grocery run, paying the rent. But risk is a far more encompassing linguistic concept.
Yeah.
It refers to anything that brings benefit.
So beyond just money.
Way beyond your wealth and your food, certainly, but also your intellect, your emotional capacity, your physical health, and even the time you are allotted.
Wow.
Yeah. So in the context of this text, asserting that this risk is ultimately distributed and controlled by a higher power is a foundational cognitive shift.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because the modern mind immediately recoils at that.
Oh, absolutely does.
Right, because if we fully surrender our sense of control over our own provision, doesn't that risk breeding widespread complacency?
That's the classic pushback.
How does the text or the historical philosophy surrounding it differentiate between trusting a higher power and just giving up on personal ambition? It seems like a slippery slope to fatalism.
That is the precise tension scholars of this text have debated for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
The framework presented here doesn't advocate for fatalism. Rather, it introduces the concept of tawakkul, which is often translated as trusting in God's plan.
Okay.
However, the classical application of this concept is best illustrated by a really famous historical anecdote regarding a man who left his camel untied, claiming he was trusting God to keep it from wandering.
Naturally.
And the instruction he received in response was to tie your camel first and then trust in God.
Tie your camel first. I like that.
Right. The philosophical argument being made in Surah Fatir is about detaching your ultimate sense of existential security from your own efforts.
So you still act.
You still tie the camel, you still study, you work, you build, but you recognize that the final outcome, the ultimate yield of those efforts, is not generated by your own sheer force of will.
You're relieving the psychological burden.
Exactly. You are relieving the psychological burden of absolute control, which, as any psychologist will tell you, is the root of massive modern anxiety.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. It is the difference between agency and omnipotence. You have agency to act, but you aren't the omnipotent director of the universe.
Beautifully put.
And that flows right into the next warning highlighted in our notes. Do not be deceived by worldly success.
Yes.
It's funny, I read that specific line in our source material right after I spent a frankly embarrassing amount of time stressing over whether a recent professional update I posted got enough engagement online.
We've all been there.
Talk about missing the bigger picture, right?
We all fall into that trap.
Yeah.
The text uses a specific framework to address this, often referring to the material world as the dunya, which linguistically connotes something that is low, close, or immediate.
Immediate, that's a great word for it.
The deception that text warns against, often termed gurur, is the illusion that this immediate low reality is the ultimate reality. The argument is that if you believe you are the sole architect of your provision, as we just discussed, then worldly success becomes the definitive metric of your worth.
Right, because it's all on you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So the text is actively warning its audience against the myopia of the material world. It suggests that material accumulation is merely a temporary condition, a circumstantial test of character, rather than a reflection of intrinsic value.
Which brings us to a point that I find to be a fascinating filter for modern life, particularly for those of us immersed in academia or the information economy. The notes outline a specific directive regarding the intellect, to seek knowledge that increases humility.
What's fascinating here is the text's underlying definition of what actually constitutes valuable knowledge.
We could get into that.
In Surah Fatir, there's a very famous verse 28, that explicitly connects knowledge to a sense of awe or fear of the divine.
Okay.
But what is critical is the context immediately preceding that verse. The chapter doesn't just talk about abstract theology. It points the reader toward the natural world.
Like nature specifically.
Yes. It describes the rain falling from the sky, the varying colors of the fruits, the diverse paths in the mountains, white, red, and raven black, and the varying colors of humans and animals.
That's very visual.
Highly visual. It is right after detailing this profound natural diversity and geological complexity that the text asserts that it is the people of knowledge who truly possess awe.
That completely flips the modern academic model on its head.
It really does.
Today, knowledge is so frequently weaponized to build prestige, to win debates, or to establish a hierarchy of intelligence. If you look at the culture of thought leadership today, it is rarely about awe. It is almost entirely about ego.
Spot on.
The text is arguing that if your deep dive into astrophysics or history or biology is making you arrogant, you have acquired data, but you have fundamentally missed the wisdom.
Right.
The knowledge should logically bring you to a realization of your own infinitesimally small place in the cosmos.
It creates a stark distinction between information hoarding and actual comprehension.
I love that phrase, information hoarding.
When you study the intricacies of a cellular structure or the vastness of a galaxy, a logically sound mind must recognize the severe limits of human capability. This directive essentially demands an ongoing internal audit from the learner.
An internal audit.
Yes. Are you acquiring knowledge to dominate your peers, or are you observing the varying colors of the mountains to better understand your place within a vast designed reality? The text argues that true knowledge inherently deflates the ego.
An internal audit is a great way to phrase it, and it perfectly sets up the next point in this first section. Because when I read this part of the notes, the phrasing caught me off guard because it sounds so clinical.
I know exactly which one you mean.
The notes instruct the reader to resist Satan's psychological manipulation.
It is a striking modernization in the phrasing of our notes, but it accurately reflects the textual reality. In the 6th verse of Surah Fatir, the text explicitly instructs the reader to treat Satan as an active enemy. However, when we encounter the concept of a devil in ancient or religious texts, the contemporary mind tends to default to medieval European caricatures.
Right, mythological figures with horns, pitchforks, that kind of thing.
Exactly, or abstract representations of general badness. By framing this conflict as psychological manipulation, our source notes translate the spiritual battle into a highly recognizable cognitive exercise.
Because the mechanics of psychological manipulation are universally understood, even outside a theological framework.
Precisely.
We all recognize the experience of intrusive thoughts, the sudden urge to rationalize an unethical shortcut, or the normalization of harmful habits. It brings the concept of temptation out of the clouds and places it squarely in the prefrontal cortex.
The text assumes that the human psyche is inherently vulnerable. It acknowledges that we are subject to profound cognitive biases and the continuous subtle whispers of our own egos. To resist in this context is not simply a matter of avoiding overtly criminal acts. It is about recognizing the insidious cognitive traps that slowly recalibrate our moral compasses over time.
It requires hypervigilance.
It is a demand for extreme mindfulness. The text asks the individual to relentlessly question their own desires, to interrogate their rationalizations, and to recognize when they are being internally manipulated into abandoning their core ethical center.
You essentially have to be the bouncer of your own brain, constantly checking the credentials of every thought trying to take root.
That's a brilliant analogy.
And according to the notes, the ultimate goal of all this intense internal work, the recalibration of provision, the unmasking of material success, the pursuit of humble knowledge, and the resistance against cognitive traps, is to be among those who excel in good deeds.
Yes.
It is not a call to passive monasticism. It is a call to take that internal refinement and manifest it outward. And the word excel is key there. It implies a standard of ihsan or ultimate excellence rather than just meeting a baseline requirement.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly how the architecture of the text operates.
Okay, take us there.
That call to external action bridges the gap to the second half of our deep dive. The notes demonstrate how the chapter shifts its rhetorical gears. We move away from the highly specific internal guidance directed at believers, and the scope expands outward to encompass a grand, universal worldview.
So we are moving to part 2.
Exactly. Part 2 of the notes outlines the themes that are addressed to mankind as a whole. It is a broader philosophical proposition.
And the propositions listed here are sweeping in their scale. First, the text asserts that the universe has a purposeful creator. And second, and here's where it gets really interesting, it states unequivocally that humans are fundamentally not self-sufficient.
That assertion of lacking self-sufficiency is arguably the point of greatest friction with the modern listener.
Oh, without a doubt.
We exist in a cultural paradigm that fundamentally champions absolute autonomy. The prevailing societal narrative, particularly in Western philosophies, is that the ideal state of being is total independence. We idolize the concept of the self-made individual, and we often implicitly categorize dependence as a character flaw or a systemic weakness.
We certainly do. The cultural mythology is built entirely around pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, requiring no assistance, and bending the world to your individual will. But this text takes a hammer to that mythology.
It dismantles it completely by pointing to ontological reality.
What does it say?
In verse 15 of Surah Fatir, the Arabic phrasing uses the word fuqara, which translates to being deeply impoverished or an absolute fundamental need.
Impoverished, that's a strong word.
It is. The text asks humanity to look objectively at its condition. Biological, ecological, and philosophical self-sufficiency is a complete illusion.
Right, because we don't exist in a vacuum.
You are entirely dependent on a highly specific, delicate mixture of gases in the atmosphere simply to survive the next 5 minutes. You are reliant on incredibly complex, fragile global supply chains for your sustenance. You depend on the gravitational constant, on solar radiation, and on the unspoken social contracts that keep civilization from collapsing overnight.
When you lay it out like that, the arrogance of claiming to be self-made seems almost absurd.
It does.
We are floating in a massive interconnected web of dependencies. The text is essentially arguing that if we cannot even sustain our own basic physiological existence without relying on a million external variables, we are fundamentally, structurally reliant on the entity that authored those variables. It forces a radical shift in perspective from autonomy to profound humility.
And that realization serves as the structural foundation for the next stark reminder highlighted in our notes. Accountability is inevitable.
Inevitable accountability.
This is the logical continuation of the philosophical framework. If you acknowledge that the universe is a designed system rather than a chaotic accident, and if you accept that you are a dependent, integrated component within that system, then your actions within that system must have consequence and purpose.
They have to.
Without the concept of inevitable accountability, any objective moral framework essentially collapses into nihilism.
The notes reference the concept that no soul will bear the burden of another, which I believe is verse 18 of the chapter.
That's correct.
It establishes a principle of absolute individual moral responsibility. We often look at the geopolitical landscape or even just our own local communities and see a world that appears deeply unjust.
Very true.
People seemingly evade the consequences of horrific actions, and individuals acting with profound integrity often suffer without any tangible reward in the dunya, the immediate world.
Right.
Framing accountability as an inevitable, ultimate reality provides a necessary grounding principle. It asserts that the scales will eventually balance.
The inevitability of that ultimate accounting provides the definitive context for human behavior. It assigns immense permanent weight to the earlier instruction to excel in good deeds, because those deeds are the only currency that retains its value in the final analysis.
The only currency.
And it is this specific context that leads us to the capstone message of the entire source text. True success is moral and spiritual, not material.
Bringing it all together.
When you synthesize every single philosophical point we have analyzed, the illusion of the immediate world, the necessity of humbling knowledge, the absolute myth of self-sufficiency, and the certainty of ultimate accountability, the very definition of what it means to be successful undergoes a radical transformation.
It requires a complete recalibration of how we measure a life well lived.
Absolutely.
If ultimate accountability is a fixed reality, and if your material wealth is simply a temporary provision over which you have no absolute control, then judging the value of your existence by material metrics is a fundamental error in logic.
A category error, really.
Right. True success within the framework of Surah Fatir can only be measured by the quality of your character, the purity of your ethical intentions, and your ability to navigate those psychological manipulations we discussed earlier.
It's all connected.
The text is offering an intellectual escape hatch from the modern rat race by simply pointing out that the finish line we're all sprinting toward is an illusion.
This raises an important question about the structural elegance of the source material itself.
Let's hear it.
When we step back and look at the chapter as a whole, notice how mathematically the two sections of the notes mirror and validate each other.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The internal specific instruction to not be deceived by worldly success in the first half perfectly anticipates and aligns with the universal external truth in the second half that true success is moral and spiritual.
Wow, yeah.
Furthermore, the specific command to seek knowledge that increases humility is the exact prerequisite needed to accept the universal reflection that humans are fundamentally not self-sufficient. The text is remarkably cohesive. The psychological conditioning of the first half directly prepares the individual to logically accept the cosmological realities of the second half.
It operates like a complex mechanism where the inner work is the key that unlocks the universal truth.
Precisely.
You literally cannot grasp your own lack of self-sufficiency if your intellect is clouded by the arrogance of weaponized knowledge. The entire framework depends on each component functioning together.
It's a complete system.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We have taken these highly distilled notes and subjected them to a rigorous analysis. We've explored the tension between agency and fatalism in the concept of provision. We've audited our cognitive biases, and we've looked at the profound philosophical implications of our own physical dependence on the universe.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that is built entirely on the underlying logic of this text, but asks you to apply it to your own intellectual journey.
I'm ready.
If true knowledge is mathematically meant to increase humility, and if human beings are fundamentally ontologically not self-sufficient, is it possible that the ultimate goal of all our learning, the highest peak of our academic and personal growth, is not to achieve mastery over our environment, but simply to recognize and perhaps joyfully embrace how deeply dependent we really are?
That is a profound question.
In a cultural landscape that constantly demands you become a self-made master of the universe, maybe the most radical, intellectually honest thing you can do is admit that you are just a fragile, dependent part of it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep questioning the frameworks around you.